Hello, hello. Welcome to the Her Hoop Stats podcast, the third annual All-Star edition of the pod. I'm Calvin Wetzel, and as we have the last couple of years, we are joined by Richard Cohen and also from ESPN, Kevin Pelton, both of whom do excellent work covering the WNBA. And as usual, we're going to have a lot of thoughts on the All-Star teams and all of the different voting process and things like that we're going to get into. So I'll come to you first, Richard. How's it going?
Yeah, not so bad. Looking forward to this. It's always interesting how much we differ from the general populace and what ends up being the actual teams.
Definitely, yeah, yeah. That's the interesting part because you have the fan vote and then you have the coaches and all these different pieces. Obviously, a lot of people disagree on a lot of it, which is what we're going to get into. So, Kevin, I know you have a vote. I'm glad that you came back on the show. Thanks for joining us. How's it going? And also, just to start with, can you kind of break down for us the system that because this year it's a little bit different with Team USA, obviously an Olympic year than what it is in the other years. And I know it's a little bit complicated. We were talking about it right beforehand. I think I understand it now, but you probably understand it better. So for our listeners, yeah, can you kind of break that down for us?
Yeah, and there's a couple of interesting nuances. So it's the U.S. Olympic team that was named a couple of weeks ago will take on a team of 12 players from Team WNBA, which is the format that they did in 2021 when the Tokyo Olympics were happening along the same timeline. I don't remember exactly what the format is they used, but basically they've taken what is normally the mechanism for voting for starters. And this year, that's going to include players who are on the USA team and are already in the game. You just pick your 10 players. And, it's going to be really fascinating because of one player in particular, and that's Caitlin Clark, because the first returns of the fan voting came out earlier today, and Caitlin Clark is, I believe, number 2 overall behind Asia Wilson. And I think this also could be relevant for her. She's number 3, and then you've got Angel Reese is number 7. So of the top 10 in All-Star voting thus far, only 5 of them are actually players who are on the Olympic roster, which is kind of fascinating. But it's not strictly the fan voting. It's a 50% component. 25% is media, which is the panel that I'm a part of the voting for, and then 25% players. And the wrinkle here is they do it based not on your total number of votes, but on your rank among the backcourt or the front court on those various different groups. So, for someone like Angel Reese, who maybe is not going to get a vote from the media, it actually becomes very relevant how many other front court players get votes in terms of determining whether she has a real chance to make it. I think, she's probably still a long shot, but she's number 3 right now, number 4 right now in the fan voting in the front court. Caitlin's number 1 in fan voting in the backcourt. I think she's got a much better chance of getting media votes, and therefore it's pretty realistic that she will be one of these 10 players voted in automatically to the game, even if she were not part of that group. The rest of the roster, the which can be up to like 24 players hypothetically, if all 10 of the starters were USA players, all of those will be chosen by reserves, who usually just choose the 14 players after the starters are chosen. So, Caitlin would kind of be on the borderline for that. It's really important whether she makes it into this group of 10.
So if I understand correctly, the backcourt front court thing is it 4 backcourt players and 6 front court players? So Angel needs to get into that top 6 of front court players in order to make this top 10. Even if she were in the top 10 overall, if she were 7th in front court players, she would not make it. Is that basically how it works?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's going to be really interesting because obviously both of those players have huge followings, which is why you see the fan vote probably higher than the media vote would be. Richard, what?
I'm just checking whether that's right or not. I'm not. I think it's just top 10 this year. It's usually 4 and 6, but I
I
think the I
Did
I
they
think it's
think
change
it
it?
is.
just
I think it is 4 and 6 because that's how my ballot is set up: is 4 backcourt, 6 front court.
right.
But
That's because
but
all
it
of
is
their press
interesting.
releases still just say top 10 vote
Yeah,
getter.
they
But
don't
yeah, it
break
wouldn't
that
surprise
out.
me if
They
that's
do
wrong.
mention front court or guard in the press release, but they don't break out the voting that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, this is this is why it's great to have a voter on the podcast here because we got the inside scoop on what the ballot looks like. Kevin, have you submitted your vote yet?
No, we have until next Saturday to do so. So I'm going to take the rest of the week. But I did, as part of this process, go through and pick who would be. And I know Richard kind of was hoping to do this a little later, closer to the actual selection date of the final 12-player Team WNBA. But the upside of doing this early, besides for the fact that it kind of needed to happen for my schedule, is, fans are still voting. So I don't know if they're going to be influenced at all by our picks, but it is useful to have those out there.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and get into it then. I know you haven't submitted your ballot yet, but from where you're at right now, who would be your 10 or your 4 and your 6?
In the backcourt, I had Sabrina Ionescu and Jackie Young, who are part of the Olympic team, and then Kayla McBride and Arike Ogunbowale, who are not. In the front court, I had 4 USA players: Nafisa Collier, Brianna Stewart, Alyssa Thomas, Asia Wilson, and then 2 who are not American, Jonquel Jones and Ezi Megbagor is my last 2 starters. Ezi probably, the most borderline position, even maybe going back and forth with her teammate Nneka Ogwumike for that spot.
Yeah, so what ended up kind of pushing Ezi over the top for you? And of course, you could still change your mind with your official ballot, but at the moment, what kind of separated Ezi from Nneka?
Yeah, I mean, I think the couple of games that Nneka missed do, slightly tip the balances in Ezi's favor. And then just the fact that, she's been a really dominant defensive presence thus far, leading the league in blocks per games. And her rim protection numbers, now that we have access to some of that tracking data, have actually even been more dominant than her blocks per game would indicate.
So, Richard, where are you at with Ezi and Nneka? And then also, did you kind of line up on the rest of that, or do you differ from Kevin on any of the other of those 10?
So can you your 6 front court were Thomas, Jonquel, Collier, Wilson, Ezi, and who am I missing?
Stewie.
Yeah, right.
You may have
for a
heard
second. For a second, I thought you didn't say Brianna Stewart, which was throwing off my list.
Unless I accidentally didn't say her. Yes, she is on my 6.
No, I thought that was probably my mistake. Well, as I mentioned before we started recording, I started with a blank sheet of paper and just started making my shortlist by going through the teams. And that gave me 2 lists, which was one where sort of people I thought absolutely were in, which got me 7 players. And then my next list which was including basically anyone who I thought had any kind of chance, which is like 32 more. And I was surprised you left out one of my top 7, which was Kalia Copper, who was one of my 4 guards who I would have in ahead of somebody on your list of 4. Otherwise, the rest of my list is on fairly similar to what you said.
Let's see here. Yeah, I mean, I had her certainly comfortably on my team, but didn't worry too much about her, I think, just given the fact that she's automatically in there.
Yeah.
Richard, so I'm gonna guess, and you can tell me if I'm right or not, who you had that was different than Kevin. Was it Kayla McBride?
Well, in my 7, there were only 2 guards. It's a lot easier to pick the first front court players than it is to pick the last front court players when you start to get to the end of these rosters. So there were 2 guards in that top group, and then the next 2 guards would have been from Ionescu, McBride, Arike. I also had Alicia Gray, Ariel Atkins, and Benijah Laney Hamilton in that same pool. So 2 of them, one probably McBride, the other I'm not sure, mate. So every time I watch New York, I'm impressed by Ionescu's offense and horrified by her defense, which makes me so wouldn't matter in an All-Star game, but when we're picking on merit, makes me reluctant to put her in my top 4. So yeah, one of them. I'm not sure who.
So, did you end up settling on a group of 3 to complement your top 7, or are you still kind of going back and forth on some of those out of your really large pool?
It would be McBride. The 7 were Alyssa Thomas, Brianna Stewart, Jonquel Jones, Nafisa Collier, Asia Wilson, and then Copper and Jackie Young for the guards. The others, like McBride, I would have Nneka above Ezi. She was actually, for what it's worth, but I can certainly see Kevin having them the other way around. And you could argue about Duana Bonner as well, I think, being part of that group. I certainly think she should be on the Team WNBA. Whether you think she's in the top 10 or not is debatable.
Yeah, without question.
Yeah, absolutely. She definitely deserves to be there one way or the other. So, Richard, what would separate NECA for you then, having NECA over Ezzy on your list?
Kevin's obviously seeing them up close, but when I've watched Seattle, they just seem to take a step up in organization and sort of composure as a team when NECA's on the court. She's even perhaps more than Skylar's given them as a backcourt leader. Has just the team looks like a veteran squad that knows what they're doing when NECA's out there. She's a leader for them. In some ways, she helps magnify what Ezzy's good at, because NECA's usually defending the best front court player, and then Ezzy can play as a sweeper behind everybody and gets all of the highlight reel blocks and things like that, because she's usually able to cheat off whoever it is that she's on at least a little bit more than NECA can on who she's defending.
I like that the Englishman managed to get a soccer reference in here.
We had to. So is there anyone else that we haven't mentioned yet that either of you considered for the top 10 or that you think might have a shot?
I can't remember if Richard mentioned Brianna Jones. I think she'd be the other person in consideration. Hasn't played as many minutes this year coming back from the Achilles, but has been at the same high level that we're accustomed to.
Her numbers are odd once I started looking sort of deeper into this when actually researching my she was higher up on my initial list than she was once I started taking the numbers into account. Her rebounding is bizarrely low. Possibly just because they like to let Alyssa Thomas grab as many as possible and immediately start gunning in the opposite direction. But yeah, certainly when you watch the game, she looks back to full strength and back to as good as she ever was. But the numbers haven't quite bounced up to what she was before the injury yet.
Well, that's an interesting one, because that's something that I've been following too. And last year, obviously, she only played 13 games, but in those 13 games, she was also playing with Alyssa Thomas, and they also liked to let Alyssa Thomas go get those rebounds. And in those 13 games, she averaged 8.2 rebounds per game. Obviously, a little bit lower minutes per game this year so far, but she's barely above half that this year at 4.6. So it's definitely something that I've been monitoring, because I'm not exactly sure, to be honest, even with watching their games, why her rebounding is down. Do either of you have a theory on that?
I mean, it's interesting because her offensive rebound rate is actually the lowest of her career. Her defensive rebound rate is down as well, but that's not the only factor. So that's interesting.
I think a little, certainly part of it is just the slow pace that Connecticut play at, which means the raw numbers come down. So if you actually look at it for rebounding percentage rather than just rebounding numbers, she's not nearly as far behind her regular numbers this season as she is in the raw numbers per game.
Yeah, that is definitely true. She's a little bit down in the rates, but not so far that you'd be hitting a panic button or anything like that on what's going on, what's wrong with her rebounding. And obviously, Connecticut Sun it's not just Alyssa Thomas, Dejanay Carrington, great rebounder as a guard, DeWanna Bonner, great rebounder. So this team is grabbing rebounds still. It's not like they're just giving up all these rebounds just because their center is averaging under 5 a game. And Richard, who would you have as your, I guess, under a standard format, we just kind of have 12 extra, but under this year's format, it depends on how many starters, like Kevin was saying at the beginning, make the, or how many starters come from that pool of Team USA, and how many don't in terms of how many reserves are coming from the rest of the pool. So I'll just throw it to you and leave it open-ended to you. Which format you want to go with, but who are kind of some of the next on your list?
Well, if we start with what we're actually having to do this year with sort of finding 12 players who aren't on Team USA, we've already talked about John Quell, DeWanna Bonner, Kayla McBride, NECA. Arike gets you to 5. The next people on my list would be Benijah Laney Hamilton, who's having an outstanding season in New York. Alicia Gray, who is, as far as I'm concerned, Atlanta's best player. De'Erica Hamby, who's having an outstanding season for LA, and who were the easiest team to pick in terms of All-Stars. I think Hamby's in, and absolutely no one else is anywhere near the conversation. And Ariel Atkins as well was on that tier of people as the only one worth talking about in Washington as well at this point, partly due to the number of players they've had getting hurt, which gets us to 9 if Kevin wants to take over, or Ezzy as well would get us to 10 if Kevin wants to take over before we start discussing the ones right on the edges.
Yeah, I mean, I have Ryan Howard in as well. Her advanced stats have pretty consistently been better than, Alicia Gray's, even though they play very similar roles. Largely I think because of her steal rate is something that always shows up in addition to her really high usage. And the other name I was a little surprised I didn't hear from Richard, that I guess I'm hoping he has in the borderline candidates, but I had, comfortably in, was Alana Smith.
I do have her on the borderline candidates, but yeah, I mean, feel free, go ahead. Why do you think she's like as comfortably in as that?
Super efficient scorer, has really stepped up as a rim protector, playing a lot of the time as the primary big in Minnesota. And, the Lynx have made this massive defensive improvement. I think everybody deserves a little bit of the credit for that, but Alana Smith has been the biggest defensive upgrade, I would say, that they've made to the roster this season.
Well, it's interesting that you bring her up, because I was, before this pod, going back and listening to last year's to kind of prepare for this. And at that time, you mentioned her again last year when she was on the Sky, and you had her, I believe it was in the top 10 of your wins above replacement player at that point in the season last year. Do you have that off the top of your head right now, where she is in that metric?
Yeah, I believe she's 8th. Let me double check that.
Top 10 again. Okay.
She is. Yeah, she's definitely in the top 10. And the other thing, or she's 11th, I guess. So just outside the top 10. But the one difference from last year is, well, now we have this sample size of, we know that this is not a fluke half of the season, which was a little confusing last year in Chicago because she had done so little previously in her WNBA career, even though she'd been effective overseas. Now I think we know pretty confidently that this is who she is as a player. And I was wondering about that. I was actually going to ask, I thought I might have mentioned her as one of my honorable mentions last year. So it's good to know that I did, in fact, do that.
You did. And that brings up something else you mentioned last year, too, that you guys kind of differed on a little bit, is whether to take into account a player, because obviously we only have such a small sample of games this season to work with when we're doing this, and whether to take into account a player's history or not, how they have performed over their career in the last year or two. And I think, Kevin, you did so a little bit more, and Richard didn't. And last year that kind of separated Alana Smith because she had performed so well in that first month or month and a half of last year, but not really the case before that. But now this year, like you said, we have, either way you look at it, we have that sample of over a full season now of her performing at this level. So, Richard, you said she's borderline for you. Have you, would you lean in or lean out? Where are you at with her?
No, I think it's entirely fair to lean in. She would be, one of the. I also had Marina Mabrey right on that same edge. Who's, one of my tweets from like a year and a half ago was retweeted by half the Chicago fan base, it felt like last week, which was just the one announcing what Mabrey's contract was when she signed in Chicago. And it was a load of Chicago fans saying, oh my God, this horrible contract, we're never going to get rid of her. But she's basically kept them afloat at times this season in terms of their offense. She's had to do a lot of it herself. I think the fact of what they gave up to get her and how much they're paying her and stuff has overshadowed that she's done pretty well since she went there, and she's been even better this season since she's been playing alongside someone who actually wants to play the point guard spot to a greater extent. So she's right on that fringe as well, and then we start to get into a next group, and we can talk about Caitlin Clark as part of potentially on this fringe as well.
Yeah, I maybe had her a little lower. To me, the 12, if we're looking at it just holistically, like we have the Olympic roster, who are the next 12 best players? to me, there was a pretty clear distinction between this group of 12. So I had Howard in, I had Mabry in, as we mentioned, Alana Smith in, and I had Alicia Gray and Hamby as my wild cards, in addition to who we've talked about. And I thought there was kind of a jump down in tiers after that. I don't know if you agree with Richard.
I had it more sort of amorphous at the end of the roster, to be honest. Did you have Atkins in? I mentioned her. I don't know if she was in your group.
No, I mean, I think the fact that Washington has been so bad this season and she's had a pretty uneven first half. Now, she's someone who, if you're making the case based on past performance, I think that helps her relative to Marina Mabry, where, she has been so much better in the past, has an all-star track record. But I thought that Mabry's advantage was enough. And then Kayla McBride's the other player, who's an interesting, in that past performance context. Like, she has not been a serious all-star contender in past years, but she's been so amazing in the first half of this season, ranking in the top 5 in wins above replacement player, that to me, she had to be in no matter what, despite that fact.
Yeah, as we've talked about before, I tend to lean more towards looking at the 15 games people have played so far this season to judge this season's all-stars, rather than giving them credit for previous years. So yeah, McBride was an absolute definite for me, because of she's been ridiculous. Offensively, she's hit everything, and she tends to be Minnesota's, well, along with Carlton, now that she's in the starting lineup, their primary perimeter defender as well. So on one of the best defensive teams in the league. So I don't think you can leave McBride out at this point.
Anecdotally, McBride is shooting 97% from 3 this year. I don't know what the actual number is, but she has to be in for me too. Atkins is an interesting case because, like you mentioned the word uneven, Kevin. I think like that she's such a perfect complementary piece to stars, and we saw that on Washington's championship team, and we've seen that in international, like on Team USA before. And when she has to be the star, sometimes it's there and sometimes it's not. And we've seen that even like her first 6 games this year, if you line up her game logs, great game, bad game, great game, bad game. It just seems like every other.
Now, if she keeps doing what she's done the past 3 games, then
yes.
She moves in, I would say.
Yes, exactly. She has stepped up a little bit, but she's a very borderline case for me as well. I think because of some of that early, like you said, uneven play. So let's talk about Caitlin Clark, because that's obviously like the big conversation, and you guys kind of alluded to it. I'll start with you, Kevin. Is she in or is she out?
She's out for this format for me. I think she was a much stronger consideration if we are, which I think we're going to talk about in a little bit here, treating this as a traditional all-star game where we're not constrained by who's on the Olympic roster and just picking the 24 best players. Like, then I think she's got a stronger case. But, I would have her below a couple of players who didn't end up making my team, including Betnijah Laney Hamilton, who is on Richard's.
Richard, would you have her in?
I would have her just outside in both formats. Yeah. I have her on the edge in terms of who I'm considering for sort of like for the 24th spot if we're doing the 12th aside, or for the 22nd spot. But she doesn't make the 22 if we were doing the last year's format for me. Once you start getting down to the reserves, there are a lot of people who the WNBA considers guards, which doesn't help her either, because that basically means she has to beat out or become one of the wild cards, where she's still competing with a whole collection of guards. So yeah, she doesn't make it for me on either team, but I'm sure in reality they'll find one way or another to get her on the team, because ABC are going to want her there, the league are going to want her there, the fans are going to want her there. She'll be on the team one way or another.
Yeah, and we see the fan vote. Obviously, she's the top guard right now, second behind Asia. So I do think she's going to find her way to the All-Star game, like you said. But I would not have her in either, personally. You mentioned, Richard, that who the league considers a guard. And so this feels like it may be a good time to bring up what you mentioned in the email, just that the positional thing gets really convoluted and confusing when they ask you to pick a certain number of forwards and a certain number of guards, but then they list certain wings as one way where maybe they shouldn't be. Can you kind of explain that a little bit, and what are your thoughts on it?
Well, it's been a bit because of the slightly different format this year. Maybe it's not as highlighted, but in previous years they've asked for 4 guards and 6 forwards as the starters, which is the same as what they're asking people to vote for right now. If you go and vote for the players, and then 3 guards, 5 forwards, and 4 wildcards for the reserves. So you're obviously, well, I'm using the term forwards because I've got it listed as 6F. The league calls it front court. But the thing is, that assumes a format for a team of 2 guards and 3 front court players, which means you should be assuming that a small forward or whoever the middle-sized player of most normal lineups would be a front court player. But the league tends to list players like Benijah Laney-Hamilton or Ryan Howard or Kayla McBride. They're all listed as guards. So you then end up having to include them in the smaller number. And then once you get down to the bottom of the list, trying to fit in extra front court players because who might be on the edge of whether they get in or not if it was just a pick anyone you want, basically.
So, Kevin, you were talking about, so the format's a little bit different this year, and maybe that's not as much of an issue. But Kevin, you were talking about the starters still in your ballot, still asking you to do the 4 and 6 thing. So, do you find when you're kind of looking at who your 4 and 6 are and who the league defines one way or the other that you're trying to fit some of these threes, some of these Benijah Laney-Hamilton types into this guard slot, or that you find yourself maybe like disagreeing with some of the positions the way they have them listed?
I mean, I don't think it was a big issue necessarily with the starters. I guess Jackie Young would be the one who, if you're looking at the way that Vegas, when healthy, lines up, she's the small forward, but she's basically played guard this season because Chelsea Gray has been out of the lineup. And so she was the only one of those that I had in the group of 10 this year. I think it's more interesting, and more relevant to when the coaches pick the remainder of Team WNBA, whether they're going to be constrained by that or not, because it's a little lower, I think, on the ballot where it starts to become an important distinction.
So if we did have that format this year, we've talked kind of a little bit about who you guys would have in as your reserves and who would be on the borderline. But Kevin, if we did have that format with the reserves this year as well, the traditional format, would that change at all? Anyone maybe get in for you that wouldn't currently under this year's format, or vice versa?
So the one player I think it was kind of relevant for, who I was surprised had as strong of an all-star case as she did when I went to go through the numbers, was Angel Reese, who I think would be right neck and neck with someone like Benijah Laney-Hamilton if you were doing an independent position. But to fill out, when I was imagining my traditional ballot, although I think I actually had it wrong now that I'm looking at it, because there were 4 wild cards on the WNBA reserve last year. So maybe it wouldn't have been an issue then. But she was the one player who I thought was like kind of on the borderline. But because I did it, what in my head is 4 reserve, 4 backcourt, 6 front court, 2 wild card for the reserves. Therefore, that bumped Reese in.
So yeah, Richard, I have your email pulled up here, and it looks like, so last year, tell me if I have this correct. It would have been, the 12 would have been 3 guards, 5 front court players, and 4 wild cards.
That was what I found for 2023. Yeah,
you would have had a little bit of leeway still with those 4, but even with that leeway, like that, would that have changed anything for you if we had to fit this year's All-Stars kind of into that same box of 3, 5, 4?
Well, once we got down to sort of the end of the list, it also brings in the element of how many players who are going to make this year's team wouldn't be an all-star if they weren't already on Team USA. Because obviously Chelsea Gray's only just played 1 game, so would not be on an all-star team. Brittany Griner's only played 5. And I want Kevin's take on this because he's been sat right there. Is Jewel Lloyd an all-star this season?
Yeah, it's a difficult question. I think in my case, because of the fact that you're considering past performance, I had her in pretty comfortably. But if you're going strictly based on who have been the best 2 players in the league this season, that's pretty borderline. I mean, she is, I think, an example of a case why it does make sense to consider past performance, because the biggest difference, her 2-point percentage hasn't rebounded the way that I think that we expected it would, with the addition of Nneka Ogwumike and Skylar Diggins-Smith to take a lot of the shot creation off of her plate. but it's really that she's shooting 25% from three. And we know that Jewel Lloyd is not a 25% 3-point shooter. She didn't forget how to shoot threes over the last offseason. That's just a small sample size issue. It's going to even out. And that's why, I would have her in.
So, would you have Kevin? So I'm looking at the 12 player roster here for Team USA. I'm counting, if you put Jewel in, I think comfortably 9 of these would be all-stars then. And obviously
Who's the
BG.
ninth? I had 8.
Well, I would have BG and Chelsea obviously out for not playing enough. And then I would have Diana Taurasi out because
What about Kelsey Plum? I mean, past performance matters, but she's had a real rough start to the season.
Well, yeah, she does have that kind of past performance element that Jewel Lloyd has with in her. She's not shooting as poorly from three as Jewel Lloyd, but by her standards, she is shooting a career low from three in the lower 30s, and usually she's hovering in the upper 30s, around 40. So I could see the case for leaving her out. I do think if you want to use that past performance thing, that would help her a lot. That's a good question, though. That's a good point because she's probably not a lock. Richard, if Kelsey Plum were not on Team USA, would you have her in the All-Star game?
Before I started ruling people out because they were either guards or front court players, I actually had both Plum and Taurasi in. They both made it for me under the perform. So I actually have 10 of no, I actually have 9 because Lloyd is fighting for the very last spot, the 22nd spot on my rosters under last year's format.
Okay, so you would have Diana Taurasi over Jewel Lloyd. Okay. She has been obviously a lot better this year in that new offense and Nate Tibbetts offense. I'm not sure if I can quite get there. Kevin, where would you be at with Diana Taurasi? Would she be borderline for you at all?
Oh, absolutely. I had her in because I was picking 24 players at first.
Okay.
I forgot that the All-Star rosters under the old format were 22, and then when I was bumping down to 22, she was one of the last 2 that got edged out. I mean, BG is also an interesting case because we could look back at the end of the season and say, well, she played 30 out of 40 games. She was an All-Star, but I do think it's probably too many missed games at this point to pick her.
Yeah, it is tough because obviously she came back earlier than Chelsea Gray and has been dominant since she came back. So she definitely would have at least a case as we move on. But with DT, for me, it's the same as what Richard was saying at the beginning of the podcast about Sabrina, where except obviously not at the same level where I watch her in offense. Even at 42 in that offense, she looks amazing. And then when I watch her on the other side of the ball, I think, yeah, she's 42 years old. So that's where I probably couldn't quite get over the hump getting her in. But I see the case.
That was one of the ones I was surprised at when I was just before we started recording, looking at on-off stats. Phoenix are actually better defensively with Diana Taurasi on the court this season.
Wow.
Which, perhaps shows that we're still using pretty small sample sizes at this stage of the season, and some of those numbers are very noisy.
Yeah, I have to think that speaks to the Mercury lack of depth as well, especially when Beck and PG were hurt, and it's not like they have any really elite defenders coming off the bench either. But it is a small sample size thing too, I'm sure. So all right, so we would all be somewhere between 8, 9, or 10 on Team USA in the All-Star game. So there's either way out of these 12, there would be a few extra spots in a regular year versus if this year when all 12 are guaranteed that spot. So I guess, Kevin, to you first, like who do you think maybe would be your 1 or 2 players that would get in if we didn't have to guarantee these spots for Team USA that aren't going to make the cut ultimately this year?
Yeah, so I think we've already talked about both of them a little bit. As I mentioned, Angel Reese was in for me, which was fascinating because, I think she's really come on over the last few weeks during this double-double streak where it's not just been good performance for a rookie, but good performance for anyone. And her on-off numbers have been quite outstanding, along with her box score production. And then Betnijah Laney Hamilton was the other one where for the 12 for Team WNBA, couldn't quite get there, but with the extra spot or 2, then I did have her in.
And Richard, would you have those 2, or who would you have kind of just missing your cut?
I mean, I would be leaning the other way for Laney Hamilton. Like, I think, again, the on-off numbers are ridiculously in favor of Lady Hamilton in New York, something like 35 points better when she's per 100 possessions when she's on the court. She makes up for a lot on the perimeter defensively for them as well. So I think sort of stuff goes beyond the box score with how good she's been for New York this year. I would not have Reese in. She wasn't, to be honest, even on my fringe list. The shooting percentage for someone who takes like 90% of her shots within 3 feet of the rim is still really shockingly bad, which to some extent is part of why her rebounding numbers are so high, because she does get so many of them off her own misses. She's been very impressive for a rookie, but I would not have her on an all-star team this year.
I think that's a little bit of why I leaned on the on-off numbers more with Angel than most, because I was a little skeptical of, hey, what's the impact of her non-spacing as a power forward? But it has not hurt Chicago thus far on offense whatsoever.
Angel's such an interesting case because she obviously, like you said, the shooting percentages are not there, and there are a lot of things across the board that have not translated yet to this level. But the rebounding is historically good for a rookie, and really on the offensive end for anyone. And some of that offensive rebounding, if you keep missing your own shot, but you keep cleaning it up and eventually put it in, it still ends up bringing some value on the offensive end. So I can kind of see the case either way for her. When I look at the sort of the value stats, which obviously have a lot of flaws in and of themselves, but I find it very interesting that Angel Reese's offensive win shares are 0.9 so far this year. Per 40, that's 0.14. Caitlin Clark is 0.4, and per 40, it's 0.03. So she's higher in offensive win shares than Caitlin Clark. And obviously, like a casual fan probably hears that and thinks like, that's wild. That doesn't make any sense. But when you factor in her offensive rebounding, Caitlin Clark's turnovers, then it starts to make you wonder who, and we know Caitlin Clark's going to be the better offensive player throughout her career, but through this first month, who has brought more value on the offensive end? And I'm not sure it's actually obvious so far. Kevin, you're the advanced stats guy with your metrics and everything. What would you say about who, in terms of those two, just kind of what they brought on the offensive end when you look at it from like a value standpoint?
Yeah, I have Caitlin rated a hair higher than Angel Reese, but like you said, it's really close competition, especially considering that, pretty clearly Angel is going to be bringing more value at the defensive end than Caitlin is at this stage.
Yeah, it's an interesting conversation to be having right now for sure, because it's not one I thought would be having. Even I was not high on Caitlin Clark starting her career because guards obviously just take a while to translate, and everyone was thinking she was going to be the MVP. All that, and we all, anyone who's followed the league knew that she was going to have growing pains. But I also don't think I saw Angel Reese in her being even remotely close at this point, even at this point in their career, in literally anything, any number or anything that you look at. Yeah, Richard, or I guess either of you, do you guys have any other kind of thoughts on the reserves or any of these all-stars that we haven't covered yet?
Well, sort of people who are on the edge who we haven't maybe brought up yet. Skylar Diggins-Smith, if you might surprise some people that we haven't talked about her as sort of one of the reserves, someone who would be sort of on, again, whether you think she's been of more value or Lloyd in the Seattle backcourt. Diggins-Smith's sort of shooting numbers are slightly better, the assists are higher, but Lloyd's scoring more, rebounds a little more. Courtney Williams has been incredibly useful and effective for Minnesota, obviously alongside Alana Smith being part of their jump in performance this year. I have a love-hate relationship with Courtney Williams because of the way that she plays. She's fantastic to watch, apart from taking so many long twos that it drives you insane every time she steps on a court. And the other one I've got on the sort of the nearly list that we haven't brought up yet was, well, we mentioned in passing, was Dejanay Carrington. Whether you sort of think she's done enough in Connecticut, whether they deserve more than the 2 or 3, depending on whether you've got Bonner, Thomas, and Jones all in or not. Yeah, it's been very effective for Connecticut on the perimeter, and again, someone who's defending the primary threat every night for the best defensive team in the league.
We saw how she welcomed Caitlin Clark to the league, obviously. Yeah, Kevin, do you have any of those borderline as well?
Most of those, that's funny though, because the Connecticut guard, and they're pretty close, but the Connecticut guard that I had on my honorable mention list was
With Ty
Tyasha Harris.
Harris. Yeah.
So, both of those coming from reserve roles this season. If you're being talked about as even, a potential, a consideration for All-Star, like shows what they've done this season. I mean, also one of the other fascinating cases we haven't talked about, Aaliyah Boston, like I thought she
Yeah.
was a top 10 player in the league last year. I had her all WNBA second team. Like her start was really rough. She's come on lately as this Indiana schedule has evened out a little bit, both in terms of opposition and time off. I think by the end of the season, it might be like, hey, wait, why wasn't Aaliyah Boston an all-star? But right now, I don't think she's quite there. And then the only other name I had, two other names I had. Tina Charles, quietly in
Yeah.
Atlanta, having a very solid season, and then Tierra McCown.
Yeah, it's interesting with someone like Aaliyah Boston, I think, because I feel like this is the case in basically like every sport where, the All-Star game is in the middle of the season. And so when you look back historically at the All-Stars, it's who had a good first half of the season. And like you said, we're probably going to look back on Aaliyah Boston's season and say she had a really good season, but that schedule was brutal. Obviously, the Fever were trying to figure out some chemistry things early on, and her first few weeks were not very good. So I guess the question with Aaliyah Boston is like, how much do you give her leeway for having to play that extremely tough schedule early on? And how much do you credit her for the fact that the last week or 2 weeks she has been playing really strong and back to where she was last year at like rookie of the year level? Like Richard, how much would you kind of weigh all of that?
I mean, I think in terms of performance and numbers, if you're just looking at the 15 games this season, she hasn't been good enough because that tough stretch that they had to play through, you have to judge on the performance that happened on the court, and they weren't good, and that makes up the majority of the games we've seen so far. Even though the last 3 or 4 games Indiana have played, you see the uptick in performance both for the team and for her. So yeah, I think she's also one who's hurt by the format this year. She got a lot closer to my team once I was trying to look for enough front court reserves in the old format. I ended up with people like Alana Smith and Brianna Jones keeping her out, but she got a lot closer under that format than she would for me as 12 reserves to go alongside Team USA in the format we've actually got to work with this year.
So Kevin, you brought up earlier the deadline. Can you remind me, when is that deadline for to get your ballot in? And then also when does this all have to be finalized?
The final rosters will be announced July 2nd. Coaches will be voting a little bit before that. So late, I think next week. The All-Star, the group of 10 are going to be announced. Well, I'm not seeing that in the press release. So maybe that's just the voting period closes. So I don't know.
So we still have a couple weeks. So we mentioned we would have obviously liked to record this a little bit closer to that, but we're recording on June 21st here. So is there, what I was about to ask, is
I
there?
think through June 27th, it looks like the voting goes.
Okay. So basically like 1 week. Does Aaliyah Boston have enough time to rack up a few more really good games, a couple more 20 and 10s or something like that to work her way in here? Or is that rough start just too much to overcome at this point?
I mean, it's going to be up to the coaches. I think it's going to be too hard, even though she's second in the fan voting, or third in the fan voting, which is definitely the Caitlin Clark effect, benefiting her, along with, by the way, Kate Martin being 12th in fan voting. Just needs a moment to be appreciated. Yeah. I don't think like she's got a realistic chance at being on any of the media ballots among the 10 best players in the league, no matter what she does this week, unless she like drops 50. But maybe she's got a chance to impress coaches enough to have a shot.
Is there anyone else for either of you who maybe is borderline out but playing way better right now, or borderline in but has kind of been slumping the last week or two, who but between us recording this and in the next week, if they kind of continue the direction that they're going, may work their way in or slide out?
I think Ariel Atkins, as we alluded to, the fact that she's been on such an uptick the last couple of weeks, she could impress coaches, I think.
Yeah, and we saw Kareem Copeland reported today that Leah Edwards is dealing with an injury. Maisha Hines-Allen is dealing with an injury now. So it might end up being Ariel Atkins just playing one-on-one for the Mystics by the time we're all done with this, which may help or hurt her case. I don't know. She's been about the lone consistent health-wise for them. But yeah, do either of you have any final thoughts on any of this All-Star stuff?
Just on your previous question, I have one player left on my long list that we never talked about. Who's the only player who I think has played more bench games than starter games, which is Kennedy Carter, who I don't think will actually make either of the teams, especially because with her reputation, she's probably not going to get a lot of coaching votes when they go through those sort of when they go to the reserves, or when they're going for the 25% that might come from the media or the players. I'm not sure whether she would be favored in that sort of area. But obviously she's been electric when she's come on the court, and All-Star voting always tends to favor offense where she shows up most glaringly. And she's worked her way into the starting lineup for Chicago. You can't ignore her whenever she appears. She's very, very effective and very visible.
Yeah, I would say she's showing up defensively with the foul trouble.
Yeah, well, yeah. You notice, but it's not always a good way.
I can definitely tell a difference, with the Sky offense. Anytime she comes on the court, just immediately 8-0 run or something like that is sparked by some of her electric playmaking. And she's been really, really fun to watch, rejuvenated there for sure. Yeah, well, thank you guys both for hopping on here and breaking it all down for us. And we'll find out who ends up getting in or out in the next couple weeks. Richard, Kevin, appreciate you guys hanging out, and this was obviously a blast. Looking forward to watching the All-Star game. And thanks for our listeners. Go like and subscribe, all that stuff. And we'll see you guys for our next episode.